But what we're going to be talking to you about today is trauma and dissociation, dissociation, and attachment, and give you a warm-up for, kind of a preview for what Dick is going to be talking to you about through our language. But, most of what we're going to say has already been said. It's a matter of rediscovering, there's really nothing new, and almost everybody who says something is saying the same thing in different language. And so, basically psychotherapy is grief work and helping people figure out how to be able to deal with grief. And if those of you who went to Bessel, I thought Bessel was just magnificent. What he had to say was the importance of being able to look at trauma from the perspective of how it affects the person in the present. So we'll be talking a lot about that. All right, so the very first thing I want to bring us into is there's been 2 or 3 studies that have changed everything, and yet, and for many of us, it was a validation of what we already knew, which is that doing trauma work and being a trauma therapist is not a subspecialty of psychotherapy. It is psychotherapy. And probably one of the most profound kinds of studies that will change everything, the whole DSM will have to change to become more trauma-based, is the ACE study, which most of you know about. 17,000 HMO members, 1 in 4 were exposed to 2 categories of experiences in childhood that were overwhelming. 1 in 16 was exposed to 4 categories. 22% were sexually abused. 66% of the women experiences abuse, violence, or family strife. Now, what does that mean? It means that at least 20% of our population have had pretty severe trauma in their lives, and that this statistic is one which all of us sort of know, but it's ubiquitous, and so much of what we're doing is dealing with that problem, and yet, 15 years ago, people pretended like that wasn't the issue. But more relevant to today's discussion, what we're trying to say is that adult psychopathology is the result of ACE. And nobody wanted to believe that. Depression is biological, it's genetic. But you can see that as much as 40 to 50% of depressed individuals have high numbers of ACEs. And so one contributes to the other. Same with alcoholism. It's a disease, meaning that somehow it's not about what happened to you, it's what's wrong with you. And yet, is it a disease? Look at the ACE for that, 4+. And then suicide, same sort of thing. So what we're saying then is that this is a model that really begins to change the paradigm. And we want to think of psychopathology as biological, give pills, and want to think about that it's a disease, and DSM has tried to keep it in that box. And what Bessel didn't say was that he was very influential in trying to get complex trauma, which is with the ACEs, into DSM, and they just threw him out and threw that whole concept out. But this will have to change that. Also, in my talk that I gave when Bessel was here, was that Stroh's study was funded by NIH from 0 to age 30, following a large sample of children who were from lower class families that had varieties of difficulties. And what he said was that caregiver, at age 30, he looked at the development of these individuals and said caregiver psychological unavailability, physical abuse, sexual abuse, and serious distortions in the infant-caregiver relationship. What's that use of language? Distortions in the infant-caregiver relationships were strong predictors of adult psychopathology. Emotional problems are developmental outcomes. That is, they derive from a process of successive transactions of the child operating over time, and links between antecedent conditions and disturbances are probabilities and nonlinear. What that means is that it's like a domino effect. The first thing happens, which is between the infant and the caretaker, which then affects them in school, which then affects them with peers, which then affects their intellectual development, which then affects their social development, and that each of those fall one after the next. And so when you say to the client, tell me more about your depression, they may pick one thing that happened to them, but it's never one thing. It's the sequential developmental factors. And yet, there's certain things that can happen to increase resiliency so that not everybody is going to have 4 plus ACEs is going to end up doomed. And what we need to do is understand more about the development of this.
So, I think something that gets confusing is how things unfold to become maximally confusing because of our resistance to seeing them initially, right? So I've been a trauma therapist for 30 plus years, and when Mark and I first started a unit, which we got an empty one and hired our own staff because in the hospital the prevailing notion was please don't ask anyone if they've had any sort of abuse or trauma. That will just undo them, and we're trying to seal off, that. And it's like, you want to seal that off so the person finally feels something about what happened to them 20, 30, 45 years ago, and they finally feel safe enough to talk about it, but we're just going to pretend like that's not worthy of attention. And I thought about that, and I say it to you now because just in the last 10 days, I had a client who is older at this point, and she said, in my freshman year of college, I was raped. It was 1968. I thought to myself, boy, 68 was one hell of a shitty year anyway, because Martin Luther King, Bobby Kennedy, it's like the end of hope. And it was really the end of hope for her. She said, it was my freshman year of college. I went home. There was no one I could talk to because my parents would have blamed me. My mother slapped me when she found out, my boyfriend and I were, spending time together in ways that could verge on the sexual. And I told my sister, but my sister held it and used it against me and held it over my head. And she said, I felt like damaged goods. I felt like my virginity had been stolen. I felt, and she is an incredibly modern, forward-thinking person, and yet that college girl was still stuck with tremendous self-judgment and tremendous shame, not only for having gone through what she went through, but because of the backdrop of it, the backdrop of not being able to tell anyone. She said, 25 years ago, when I moved, I thought, okay, well, maybe there's some services now, and I called somewhere, a therapy clinic, and I said, this happened to me, it still impacts me, and they said, oh, that was so many years ago, that couldn't be what's upsetting you now. So I forget sometimes that the battle still goes on, and that what the pendulum seems to do is, whoops, that's what the pendulum does. It swings that way, and it knocks a bunch of stuff down as it swings this way. And, my feeling is, as ever, that you have to look at the things that happen that impact people, and whether you want to elevate them to calling them trauma, or whether you want to call them aversive childhood experiences, or whether you want to call them things that continue to spin off repetitive negative self-messages, call it what you will. The things that happen to people, as Mark's saying, have to be worked through. And we have a society that says, oh, put that behind you and move on. So no one really comes out, mostly, of the grief that they reasonably feel about loss. And so they never regain some of what was lost and are able to build on it as a foundation. And that's a crime. And Mark said, don't talk for 5 minutes at a time about one single slide. So
we only have an hour hours, so
Yeah.
there's a lot to say. So Dick's idea then is that we have burdens. And why I like this concept of burdens is that we all have burdens. It's not them and us, number one. And number two, that maladaptive parenting is at the origin of adult psychopathology. And so if you believe what Schwartz was saying, then it's not really PTSD, and it would be complex trauma, but to get away from that term, it's just that each of us carry certain burdens. And so he has this concept which he calls unburdening, which he finds critical to being able to heal. And he'll be talking to you about that. So it's sort of a preview of some of the events. All right, so
That was a good one.
one more time. No. All right, you're going to have to look at that in your hand in the handout.
So I'm going to summarize that slide quickly that won't stay here. Basically what happens is with trauma and with non-trauma, with burdens, with the things that happen that are injurious, and especially the things that happen that are injurious that we have to face alone, like my client. She had nowhere to go with it. Because what makes trauma trauma is the reaction of the environment to what happens to you and whether you can find amelioration or exacerbation there or silence. And so that's what makes trauma trauma. Because if it could be worked through at the time and metabolized and you could come out the other end, you would. Because you want to. Because you don't want to be stuck with it, but you don't know how to do that. And so you need, you need adult mammals around you that can help you do that. I mean, I think a lot of these birds would probably be more helpful when they were alive at helping their young deal with things like that than some of the situations that people find themselves in. But in any event, what happens when you don't finish things at the time is that more and more things get compartmentalized. It's like they're in a bunch of plastic Tupperware containers, in the basement of your psyche. And you try to forget they're there, and no spring cleaning touches them usually. Or you kind of look at it and you go, yeah, maybe next year. And there's so much in the unconscious that your energy and your vitality for life is mostly just keeping that closet door shut and functioning. And people do an awesome job of functioning for a period of time. It's remarkable what people can do with all those closets filled. But then eventually, it can't last forever. And the problem is that it takes away more and more of you. More and more of the true self, of the totality of your being, your vitality has had to be exiled in order to keep all that from surfacing. And so it's not really life, it's survival. And survival is excellent compared to the alternative, but it isn't life. Keep going, okay. Don't keep going.
Okay, so then you split off.
Right. Okay, now I need my glasses, because I see there's a page here. Okay, so if you have this up and could see it, it would say that our unconscious gets bigger as we go clockwise around the circle. And then what that really means is that you don't have free will. We're so big on free will, we think we have it, please. Ideally, theoretically, we have it. But how can you have free will if you don't even know yourself and you can't choose the things you would like to be able to choose? And we know that choices are constrained by schema and by unfinished business that cause us to repeat patterns that we never intended to repeat, or to rebel so much against the patterns we never intended to retreat that we find ourselves living in reaction to them regardless. And so, without resolution, the unconscious gets bigger, our lives get smaller, our selves get more constricted. And as Dick will say later, true self, well, he doesn't call it true self, self, capital S, is really banished. It's like, it's under all that stuff that's in the closets. Because everyone's got a self, as he'll talk about, but getting to it through all the piles of things is another matter. And so then we adapt. And so parts take over and overdevelop themselves, and we become over-identified with them. So in order to mitigate the shame that we feel, we, go get some degrees and achieve some things and point to that, and it never feels quite redemptive enough because we're actually not healing the injured part. We're just putting coverings upon coverings over it. And eventually we have to strip it down, which of course God knows everyone looks forward to in therapy. Could we strip me down to the very basics? Yeah, I really appreciate that a lot. If you could just do that this week, because my insurance really won't cover much. So anyway, people adapt as best they can. And some of the ways they adapt are usually a denial of needs, because you can't really trust. You can't really trust other people because people have betrayed you and you haven't worked through it. You haven't just figured out that it's about them and quite possibly not you at all. So you can't really trust people globally, which makes you kind of lonely in the world. And moreover, you can't really trust yourself because, like my client, she still blames herself. And I thought when I listened to her, oh my God, you still blame that freshman college girl for being raped, which is what your family would have done, which is what you feared, but it's going on inside you all these years. And I think to myself, we're going to launch a course in therapy in which ultimately she'll be able to have the compassion for that part of herself that no one in her early attachment environment had. And that's really the key, which we'll be talking more about. But in the absence of that, most people, I think live lives of quiet desperation, even though that's a misstatement of the original quote, but I think so. And can you tell I'm pretty caffeinated now?
And carved.
And, we try to fill the void, which a good friend of mine who wrote a book noted that it's a void dance, a dance around a void, avoidance. And that's what we can do if we're really clever and can fool ourselves well. For a lifetime, we can avoid the painful areas and, think that we're living a life well lived until we wake up around middle age. And then most people will play a few rounds of golf and then keel over of a heart attack and, the eulogy will be good. But that's not enough probably for people in this room. And I hope it's, not any longer going to be the tradition. So we try to fill the emptiness, but there is no feeling the emptiness because the emptiness is really not just the loss of connection with others, but the loss of connection with self. You don't trust self. You don't know self. And it's like the mission to discover oneself has been thrown off, and it's hard to figure out where it got thrown off because it wasn't one thing. It was so many things along the way that eventually you don't even know where you lost track of who that was. And so instead of self-love, there's self-rejection and self-hatred. And as Bessel said the other day, you can have other things in place. You can have mindfulness, but if it's just mindfulness and self-compassion doesn't ultimately accompany it, so what? So mindfulness is a great start. Everything's a great start, but anything that doesn't culminate in self-compassion ain't there yet. And then ultimately, and this may inform the political decision currently, though Lord knows I'm not going to talk about politics, but then what happens is when you can't stand parts of yourself enough, you find other people who have those and try to fix them, in other people, great, rather than being able to know how to transform them in yourself because you need some help for that. And you see them in other people, and you hate in other people what you disowned in yourself. And as long as that's true, you'll be at war seemingly externally, but in reality, the war is internal. Because you've got polarized parts battling for their idea of what will keep you safe. And some of their ideas are extreme. And then that isolates you both from yourself and from others and gives you a life not worth living. And so then people say, I don't know about sticking around, which is a tragedy because look at this beautiful planet. Okay.
So then projection is what makes the world go around. We get in a relationship and we project that, the disowned parts of self on the partner. And so the end result of this is reenactment. And what I want to focus on in this Valentine's Day is how so much of what happens in a relationship is reenacted. And so Lori and I are working with a couple, and the sort of problem du jour is that when his wife does his t-shirts, there's a spot on them, and he's very, very upset because she doesn't put the special cleaner on the spots, even though he's told her many times. Pre-sew. And so then she gets very defensive and angry, and then they get upset for a week. And in the old form of therapy, you used to call that communication and begin to deal with what's going on between them. But if you pull back from the model, what's going on is that he's feeling that nobody took care of him as a child, and is taking that unfinished business and projecting it onto her. And she feels like no matter how much she does, she's not appreciated, loved, or cared for, and she's projecting that onto him. So what happens is that each of these transactions becomes a window into the unfinished business of the childhood. And so the basic model is that the key to working with couples is that it's not about the problem that couples bring in is never the problem. It's a problem or a manifestation of the problem, but it's not the problem. The problem is always the unfinished business from the family of origin, the split off parts of self, and then projecting that upon the partner and recreating the unfinished business from the family of origin that should try to somehow finish it and complete it. And it's a psychodynamic model, again, rediscovering the wheel, but is really antithetical to so many of the approaches to couples therapy that somehow unfolded in the cognitive behavioral revolution. All right, so what we've said so far is that there are these critical adverse events that overwhelm the child in their development. And part two is that the early attachment environment is the critical element which then begins to cover over the development of self. And so the big finding of Sroth was that there is a subsample of such individuals who've been abused who have what's called disorganized attachment. And disorganized attachment is that somehow when they start moving close to someone, they feel scared. And when somebody gets too distant, they feel abandoned. And so it's like they're constantly moving towards and away. So there's an approach avoidance kind of concept that begins to happen. And so in this slide, what we show is the predictors of disorganized attachment. And then the major finding was that the result of disorganized attachment is adult dissociation, which is basically a fragmentation of the self system. And so to me, what good psychotherapy is always about is taking these disowned, projected parts of self and beginning to integrate them into the whole. And as you do that, a person's capacity for real self increases, and their capacity for happiness and joy and love increase. And the goal is basically integrating. And what blocks integration are these adverse events and loyalty to the family that keeps people from basically minimizing and denying what happened to them. So the major finding of attachment research is the collection of robust statistical evidence linking unresolved attachment to infant disorganized attachment. Unresolved memories of past attachment-related traumas and losses in the parent strongly predict disorganized attachment in the child.
That is important because of the next slide. It is noteworthy that the reporting of resolved memories of past traumas and losses in the parent's AAI does not predict disorganized attachment in the child. Why is that important? Because there's no family that ever walked the earth that figured all of their stuff out in one generation. I mean, in America, contrary to popular realization, most of us, our families came here as immigrants. Oh, or if we were already here, we were destroyed by people who came. So yeah, trauma, trauma, trauma. And most immigrants who came were trying to leave oppression. And that's what happened with my grandparents. They, you know, in their tiny village, the Cossacks would come in, kill, rape, maim, kind of like what happens in lots of places nowadays that we don't want to read about. But, you know, they were going to be dead or they were going to figure a way out. So they didn't have a lot of luxury to be able to work through all that. They were just surviving. So they survived, and then there wasn't birth control, so they had a bunch of kids, which is good because at least they liked each other enough for that to happen, my grandparents. And you know, then they tried to live through all kinds of circumstances, not speaking the language in a new country, not having any frame of reference, and raising their children as best they could with some ethical integrity and trying to feed them. And that was plenty. I mean, the Depression happened. So by the time my parents grew up, even though I have to say, my mother really put a lot of effort into working through her own stuff. She was kind of ahead of her time that way, and she worked through a lot of it, and there was plenty of it to work through. But she couldn't quite get it all by the time I came along. She was running out of time, you know, and they only had time for me, actually, and so there I was. And she had me at 41, just under the wire. And so whatever my grandparents hadn't resolved by then, which, how would that happen? And whatever she hadn't been able to get to and resolve, I would inherit. So, you know, we do this black or white thing like, was my family a good family or a bad family? I don't know, your family was a family. And even the best family had unworked through things that, you know, when you came down that birth canal, they had ready for you, tied up with a bow, and you were going to get it, along with every other thing they could think to give you that would help you work through it. And you know, some of those packages, they're complex. So sometimes, you know, people think, well, my family was good, so what the hell's wrong with me? I don't even deserve to be this screwed up, which is a favorite of mine, because I wondered that once. Why? I mean, I should be far healthier for the good part. But you see, one thing doesn't negate the other. One thing doesn't negate the other.
And then the result of all that is that what we see is that the principal problem is disorders of self. And that people have this emptiness inside that comes from splitting off these parts of self, which they often fill with addictive behaviors. And addictive behaviors are symptoms, but recovery means that you begin to re-own the disowned parts of self and fill the emptiness. And so there's a black hole inside that you're trying to fill. And that black hole, called the addictive personality, is basically a lack of self-cohesion. And so self-cohesion has to do with dissociative phenomena. And most of us were never trained in dissociative phenomena. As a matter of fact, we were taught that it was sort of a fringe. And so pathological dissociation is not necessarily always the outcome of violent, abusive, humiliating interactions between an adult and a child. We were taught that severe trauma causes dissociation. But that what happens is that parental communications that are frightening or confused, but not obviously maltreatment of the infant, may set dissociative mental processes in motion. Now, this is the critical piece then. And what Lori's saying is, the person says, well, I wasn't sexually abused, I wasn't locked in closets, then why do you think that I have a fragmented internal cohesion? And the answer is that we have to get away from the idea that trauma is the cause of dissociation, but that any kind of double binds in the family of origin can result in this split off, confused parts of self. And so, in many ways, it's basically a rediscovery of self-psychology. Not that we ever need to rediscover it, but a lot of people were not trained in Kohut and their original training, or Winnicott. And it's really worth going back and reading both of them. But when I reread Kohut, I thought this was a really important quote. He says, the subordinate self develops from a core self or a nuclear self, which does not begin as scattered nuclei, which was his first idea, that coalesce, but rather as a self, which from the beginning of life constitutes a superordinate configuration that is the basis for our sense of being independent center of initiative, perception, integrated with our most central ambitions, ideals, with our body and mind, and form a unit in the space of a continuum of time. Okay, in English, what that means is that he thought somehow that self was developed. But in his later years, what he basically began to realize was that the core of self we're born with. And like Lori was saying earlier, Dick's concept was that self is innate, and that what we have to do is remove the blocks that somehow interfere with the manifestations of self. And that's a core concept in how we work, because you don't teach a person to have a self. What you do is you look at what it is that has interfered with it or blocked it in some way. And so when these disowned parts of self manifest, the person has a tendency for the unconscious to begin to bubble up. And so Alice Miller says this elegantly: the need to repeat has a positive side. Repetition is the language used by a child who's remained dumb, the only means of expressing himself, the unconscious. A dumb child needs a particularly empathetic partner if he's to be understood at all. Speech, on the other hand, is often used less to express genuine feelings and thoughts than to hide, veil, or deny them, rather to express the false self. So there are often long periods of our work with patients during which we're dependent upon their compulsion to repeat for this repetition. So the way that translates itself is I'll say to the client something like, tell me a little bit about what's happened over the last 24 hours or week or whatever. And I listen to where they got stuck or where their problems lie. And I'm listening really carefully, and that becomes the window or the door to begin to deal with the unfinished business of the past. And so whether you're dealing with a couple and they're talking about the spot on the shirt, or whether you're dealing with an individual who's decided they're going to relapse during the week, that relapse, instead of being bad patient, not working your program, it's more, what is it that we've missed that might somehow inform us? That relapse is part of recovery, and recovery is a peeling of the onion, understanding what in the past, what is in the unconscious is still affecting the conscious, and leaves us a door to begin to help the person re-own these split off parts of self. All right, so then the basic philosophy is the trauma reenactment syndrome. That addiction is always about trauma reenactment. And so we're dealing with alcohol, drugs, eating disorder, sexual addiction. And what we began to see is the commonality over these addictions rather than the separateness. We think the mistake has been that there are eating disorder centers, and alcoholism centers, and CD centers, and sexual addiction centers. Because most of our clients have multiple addictions. As one goes down, another one comes up. And each of these specialties requires a different kind of training. And so what we began to recognize is that putting these people together was far more valuable than separating them, because they had so many things in common, even though there were some things in different. And what they had in common was trauma reenactment, a sense of being at war with their own body. So it's somehow in the body. Excessive secrecy as a central organizing principle. You can't speak about it, as Alice Miller said, you can't even know it in many cases. The inability to self-protect, often evident in a specific kind of fragmentation of the self. And so what happens is the person feels vulnerable and therefore terrified of close relationships, and relationships in which the struggle for control overshadows all else. And so addiction is about over-control because they're feared, and the schema of safety, trust, esteem, power, control, and intimacy are all injured. And what one has to do is to begin to repair those injured schema, because the person is reenacting them or repeating them in all relationships.
So what Dick's going to be talking about today is, I think, one of the most efficient methods for doing cognitive restructuring, if you will, as well as unburdening trauma, as well as connecting the human being with their own innate wisdom more reliably, more often, so that, you know, the person who knows how to drive internally, metaphorically, is the one driving the bus, as opposed to all the school children who don't have the driver's license yet, potentially. I think that, again, I'm still kind of hung up on this hair that's on my tongue. Don't you hate when that happens? It's a small thing, and yet so salient. So, yeah, I think as R.D. Laing attempted to say back in a world far away called the 60s, 70s, the things that happen that are confounding are not just about overtly traumatic things. The things that are confounding are that which is irreconcilable. And if you think about a child's capacity to understand the world, I think about my capacity to understand the world back when I was a relatively bright child, but I certainly didn't understand how things worked in the way that I'm still wrestling with. And so whatever assumptions you made as a child just cannot be the final analysis by which you assess things going forward. But that's what schema are all about. And it's schema that cause reenactment, because what we anticipate, we accidentally, like our worst fears that we anticipate, we accidentally cause to happen, which is the last thing we want to do. One day it occurred to me to say, and maybe I'm quoting someone, but I can't think who it would be, that our worst fears have actually already happened. Yeah, otherwise we wouldn't know that we're so damn scared of it. And, you know, as Dick talks about with protective parts that are the firefighters, which we'll explain for those of you that are like firefighters, what happens is those parts are just determined never again. So they will kill you before they let you re-experience a fate worse than death, which is how whatever it was felt when you were a child. And whatever it was felt that way because you probably had no backup whatsoever. So I think all of us owe it to ourselves and our forebears, even if our forebears say, oh, no, don't go there, you don't need to go there, don't go there. But we owe it to everyone to go back and rethink our conclusions, our original conclusions in childhood, and just bring the wisdom that we've been able to gather and that can be released from that innate source of wisdom, which Dick calls the self, and bring it to bear on our experiences as we reformulate them in a broader context. Is that making sense to people? Yes. Right. And so nobody escapes. You know, your job as someone's offspring or someone's grandchild, you're not a priest, unless you're a priest, in which case you're a priest. Yeah. But most of us, your job is not absolution or condemnation. Your job is to rework what you got and understand it in a broader perspective and heal yourself with help, not alone. I was going to catch that.
All right, so the model which I mentioned earlier is Freeman's model from 1992, which was the unfinished business is a present emotional reaction shaped by a past experience. It's a reactive response guided by strong emotional feelings. So unfinished business is what happens in relational kinds of therapy. Unfinished business does not allow for a thoughtful, creative response to a here and now situation. Rather, it triggers an emotional reactive response. Who we bring into our life, our major life decisions, how we embrace important people, and the amount of closeness and distance we need emotionally are all shaped by unfinished business. Relationship problems are more a collection of unfinished business than expressions of lack of commitment, caring, and love. So if you read this last line, what I'm saying is that in some ways what we need to do is, instead of divorcing one another in marriage, we need to divorce our family of origin. And so at a time when a person's divorcing, it's probably the major time to look at what, basically doing an autopsy on the relationship and figuring out what it is that they've reenacted and they're repeating in some way, in order to not recreate it in the next relationship or the opposite in the next relationship. So Masterson says this just beautifully, which is that the intracyclic conflict, that is, we're at war with ourselves, and there's polarized parts, as Dick says. A part of you is really wants to get close, a part of you wants to get distant. A part of you is really angry, a part of you is really loving. A part of you is feeling scared, and a part of you is feeling safe. These battles inside of the disorganized attachment sets the outer world, would manifest itself in interaction with others that cannot strictly be called interpersonal, because they are essentially extensions of individuals' problems from the past. These problems are played out using one another for his or her real self, but as an involuntary actor cast in a role from a scenario the patient repeats in the present in order to avoid past memories and feelings. Isn't that elegant? What he's saying is that our inner relationships are basically a form of psychodrama. And what's happening is we're taking these battles inside. Am I lovable? Am I not lovable? Do they love me? Do they not love me? And they're taking these polarized warring parts inside, and we're projecting it out on the partner, and that what is going on between you and your partner is really like an actor on a stage playing out, unfinished business. And so if a client gets mad at you for being late to the session, not being late, but then it always becomes a door into what is it that represents that the person is enacting in some way, and is a clue that guides you in some key kind of way.
So it's not just challenges and stressors that mess up the delicate balance inside that we create around polarized parts and different ways of feeling about the same thing. Sometimes it's positive things like falling in love. So for example, just to illustrate what Mark was describing, you fall in love. And young parts who had given up on that idea surge up to the forefront because they're like, yes, finally, it's like they're starving. Finally, they're going to get fed something and something delicious. However, other parts, your protectors, are like, oh no, this never ends well. Let's nip this in the bud right now. Those are the managers. It's like, So the manager tries to, has you make a list of the good and the bad qualities of the person. That doesn't work because, your fire's on. So then the firefighter, as Dick calls those protectors, comes out and says, oh, hell no. And it brings out the big hoses. And it's like, well, let's see if he or she still loves me after I go out drinking. Oh, God, yeah, they're still hanging on. Can't scrape them off yet. Okay, what about if I sleep with their best friend? Let's see if they can still stay on after that. Oh, God, no, that didn't work. How can I scrape this person off, like going through the doorway, so that I don't have to deal with the inevitable other shoe falling where they abandon me because I'm not really worthy. So, I think anytime these things happen, what's important is to go back to the parts that feel unworthy, who will sabotage, who are obliged to, who protectors are obliged on behalf of to sabotage your relationships, because protectors just don't want your vulnerable parts to be hurt again, and they can do all kinds of crazy things to make sure that never happens. So I think that both tragedy, God forbid, and elation and new things becoming available yet again are opportunities to do some work on healing the parts that keep your life and your choices and your options and your free will constrained, so that you can have a life of love. Okay. Also known as a love life, right? Because it's Valentine's Day.
I love
The calming or stimulating effect which the addict obtains from the drug is impermanent. Whatever the chemical nature of the substance that is employed, no psychic structure is built. The defect in self remains, the injury to self is unhealed. It is as if a person with a wide open gastric fistula, I don't know what that is, were trying to still his hunger, oh yes I do, through eating. Fistula just is a weird word though. He may obtain pleasurable taste sensations by his frantic ingestion of food, but since the food does not enter that part of the digestive system where it is absorbed into the organism, he continues to starve. Well, Kohut understood addiction and eating disorders and love.
Many people can't receive it.
Well, yeah, because if you can't receive, you can't receive a lot of things. And food is love, and if you can't really take in food, well, then you can't probably really take in love either. But the problem with addiction is, hey, if it worked, if it lasted, if it really changed something in a good way over the long term and wasn't addictive, then maybe it would work. But it can only temporarily assuage the emptiness, as we all know, whatever our addiction is that we've tried, or multiple addictions that we've probably tried in a lifetime, whether socially authorized or not. And so what has to happen is, what happens is that, again, the pendulum swinging. So some people say, I have no needs, and they starve, and they deprive themselves, and deprivation becomes a way of life, or for a period of time. But if they're alive enough, if they can't kill off the spark entirely, which I always hope is the case, that they can't kill off that spark of desire entirely, because when desire is dead, you might as well be dead. So some spark remains, and for them, it's like every client who ever started to binge would just love to get back to feeling in control by restricting effectively. No. That's only a temporary answer that makes you feel in control. But the problem is that when you take in at a binge level, it's not satisfying because you're just trying to inundate the feeling just as you're trying to starve the feeling the other way. So oddly, this being able to receive thing and to metabolize and to take the nutrients from and to feel nourished at all levels is really the ultimate goal.
So, when we call this lecture Intimacy and Intimacy Disorder, and the core of an intimacy disorder is a person's unable to receive love. And so what happens is that gastric fistula idea, and so it's like a hormone that can't bind to the receptor site. The love comes in, but it doesn't connect. So one client will say something like, I don't seem to love like other people love. The feelings I get don't seem to be similar to the other person's feelings. Another client will say, what I'm afraid would happen if I give up is I'll be alone. And my addiction is almost like my friend or my lover, and I need it in order to survive or I'll be alone. And my biggest fear is being alone, I'd rather be dead. And so their addiction becomes necessary for their ultimate survival. And so the ultimate cure for intimacy disorder, however it manifests itself, is to begin to be able to have the capacity to receive love, to feel connected. One of my clients said, when I was in your program, everybody thought that I was so charismatic, and I had so many friends, and I looked like, I was the center of attention, everybody liked me and I liked them. But ever since I left, what I can tell you is the truth, which is that when I'm with people, I'm alone. And those were all like an actor on a stage. And I enact these kinds of things, but I don't really feel connected to the people. I'm alone when I'm with people. And it's like you totally miss that unless you understand that at the core of addiction is the inability to connect in some deep kind of way. So for me, psychotherapy has always been about beginning to have a diagnostic system for intimacy disorder and to look at the different subtypes of intimacy disorder. And I'll end with this, which is there's some interesting work on attachment in children. And the same kind of trauma can result in two kinds of trauma. One is reactive attachment disorder, which is heavily on the avoidance side. And the other one is this kind of reactive attachment disorder where people go out and they promiscuously bond with anybody, but really don't feel any love at all. And they just attach, but there's no connection. And you get this particularly with severe trauma, like people who are raised in an orphanage. And then what they do is they then have these children get adopted out and then follow them. People who have avoidant attachment or reactive attachment disorder, they tend to get markedly better when they're adopted. But the ones who promiscuously fall in love with anybody never get better when they're adopted. And they never get better in their lives. So the two findings are, one, attachment disorder in children is always caused by severe abuse and neglect. Never not. And the second finding is that the same trauma can result in either avoidance or a high degree of preoccupation. And avoidance can get better through exposure kinds of therapies, but this kind of inability to really feel a sense of love does not ever get better. And if you think about that in a global kind of way, we all have bits of that. And so when we pretend to connect to others, but we don't really feel it, receiving love is the central problem of psychotherapy. And when we get into relationship after relationship after relationship, we still feel empty, a gastric fistula. And so we need our addiction because we feel that sense of emptiness. Does that make sense? And so, I don't know, I always feel like that our model of treating addiction, which is to get rid of the symptom, actually is unfair. Because you're taking the person's only ability to connect away, but you're not understanding the function and purpose of it, and you're not repairing the damage. Going to 12-step meetings is useful in an exposure kind of way, but if you can't connect, you're just putting a person like an actor on a stage, and they're dry drunk. And dry drunk is a much more robust concept than I think we really fully understand. Dry drunk, at its lowest common denominator, is the inability to really feel connections with anybody and feeling alone. And sentencing a person to aloneness is not something that I really want to do. So the solution.
The solution is what Duke's going to talk to you about, since he's here now. Hi, Dick. For the rest of the day. And we were the opening band, in case some of you were like, who are those people? And yeah, I think just to conclude, what Mark's saying is a really competent false self can kind of only take you so far. And it's a great adaptation. So a lot of us operate out of what Dick's going to say used to be called pseudo-self parts, but are now called self-like parts because the parts didn't like being called pseudo. And I think a lot of us are satisfied with that, but there's still that internal void and that internal constriction that comes from estrangement from so much of ourselves and so much of the parts that once contained the most vital and creative energies. And so a person could make kind of an unholy bargain and just be a false self for a lifetime. But what Dick will be talking about in a more detailed way today is a kind of healing that when I first heard about it, I thought, how long ago is that, Dick? About 15 years or something? I was young then, that's what I remember, well, relatively. And, huh?
You're still young and beautiful.
Oh, please. Thanks, happy Valentine's. And I thought, yeah, Dick's come to the same conclusion we all have. Isn't that great? And then I listened harder and listened longer, and I thought, oh, but he's developed a technology that actually allows for getting in there and being able to work with the protectors in a respectful way that then allows access to the vulnerable parts, not in some preemptive way, but in a also respectful way, and that allows for deep healing to occur if a person is able to stay with the process. And I mean by a person, usually the therapist, because that's where the challenge is, because usually the therapist has a part that's like, oh my God, we're failing. And you've got to get that part to step back in your therapy sessions and then get someone like Dick to help you figure out what to do with it later. But there is the possibility, not just of talking about the past, not just of accepting the past, not just of prematurely forgiving everyone that hurt you, which isn't really resolution, but of actually unburdening the things that were taken on, including the beliefs, the schema, the feelings, the shame, etc. And the only real way is to transform trauma. And in the transformation of trauma, we regain ourselves and all the parts of us. And they regain life and their original purpose for which they came into existence before they got out of alignment. So Dick will spend the day talking about that, and we will take a break now so that people can find seating and have coffee, and thank you, Gary.
Thank you.
Hi.
Morning.
It's great to be back with Mark and Lori. We had quite a run for a couple of years at a place like we're running called Castlewood, where we converted the whole place into this model. And it was very dramatic what we could do with sometimes very severe eating disorder clients. In fact, my current marriage came out of that project. Not that she was an eating disorder client, but she actually ran an outpatient service that referred eating disorder clients all over the country, and was amazed at the results of the people she sent to Castlewood, and got interested in what was the difference, and came to us along to the workshop I did, and the rest is history. So, anyway, I'm honored that Mark and Lori are still cooking with IFS, and I guess talk to you for an hour and a half, a little bit about it, and I'll talk some more about it. We might be able to show some video. We're not sure if the audio is going to work on this setup. If not, I'll do a demo or some kind of thing like that. And then we'll also do some experiential kind of things. And this being Valentine's Day, I thought I would also focus on the issue of intimacy and love for yourself, and whether that's actually possible. This model is good for that. So, I'm gonna. How many of you already know some stuff about IFS? Okay, so how many don't know much? I'm just trying to gauge where to put this intro. How many of you are multiple personalities? I don't mean how many of you have multiple personality disorder, but how many of you have never had this experience? You're in an intimate relationship, you get into conflict, and you find yourself watching yourself take the whole relationship down the tubes, unable to stop it. It's like some part of you took over, hijacked the bus, and was driving it off the cliff, and you're just watching that happen. Anybody never had that experience? So that's my contention, that wasn't just your temper. It wasn't just a little bundle of anger inside of you, but that in fact, if you were to focus on that experience of anger and get curious about it, rather than feel guilty or feel hating of it, and just ask some questions, you will learn that it's not just a bundle of anger, that in fact, it's a part of you that's been trying to protect you in different ways, that it protects other parts of you that are very, very vulnerable, that it's also, if you really stay with it, frozen in time in the past, at a time where it had to do this job for you, and isn't really living much at all in the present. It actually thinks that you're still 4 or 5 or 6 years old. And doesn't like this job of having to be the rage, but has a lot of fear about what would happen if it didn't do its job. So that is what I'm calling a part. It's a full range interpersonality. And my contention is that we are all multiple personalities, and that that's a really good thing. That one mind couldn't do everything we have to do at the same time. And my friend Bob Falconer and I just wrote a book where we track the history of this idea that the mind is normally multiple. That multiplicity is normal. Through the history of psychotherapy, through the history of our culture, also how so many different branches of science take this position, and that it would pop up in our culture in psychotherapy and then be pushed back down over and over. And I'm just another manifestation of that. But that's my position, that the mind is naturally multiple, that we're born with what I call parts, and that they all contain valuable qualities and resources, and that our experience in life has the effect of taking you out of the naturally valuable roles into roles that they don't like but feel is necessary for your survival, and are also driven by this very important concept that I heard Mark and Lori kind of play with a little bit, the extreme beliefs and emotions that came into your system from traumas, from attachment injuries, and attached to these parts, almost like a virus or a computer virus, and drive the extremeness of the part, which we call burdens. So this is one big distinction that most of the field hasn't made in the past. Distinction between a part and then the burden that it carries that organizes it, that drives the way it operates. And how if that part is willing to unload the burdens it carries, it transforms into its naturally valuable state, sometimes immediately. So most of our culture and the field has made this mistake of equating the part with the burden that it carries, and then try to throw the baby out with the bathwater. Does that make sense? So this part is not a burden. It's not the burden it carries is a really important concept. And so we all have these parts, and in addition, and I just stumbled into this discovery, there is what I'm going to call the self with a capital S, that I know Mark and Lori were talking about a little bit. So, in the early days, my clients were talking about these parts. I had no idea coming into it. I come from a very scientific family, atheistic family, and I thought my clients first were just using that language as metaphors. But they were talking about these as if they had a lot of autonomy and were real full personalities. And then I got scared and thought maybe they were all DID. And then I started listening inside myself and oh my God, I've got them too. And some of mine are as extreme as theirs around food and other things. And then I got curious and I started to explore the territory. Having been trained as a family therapist, I was very interested in how they related to each other. And very intrigued by the fact that many times the description from my clients paralleled what I was studying and watching in families. Hence the name, Internal Family Systems. And initially I made the same mistake that the field still makes, which is to assume that the parts were what they seem. Rather than they're carrying burdens, they were, the critic was an internalized parental voice. The binge was an out-of-control impulse. And when you think of them that way, you don't have much leverage. I mean, you only can relate to them in certain ways. So I was doing that. I was trying to get my clients to stand up to the critic, control the binge. My clients were saying it's getting worse, but I was like the man in a hole with a shovel. I didn't have any other tools. So I said, just stand up stronger, control more, and things would get worse still. Until the first client I was aware of that I had had a sex abuse history and cut herself on her wrists. And I decided I was not going to let that cutting part out of my office until it agreed not to do it one session. And after I badgered it for a couple hours and she did, it finally said it wouldn't cut her. And then I opened the door to the next session and she had a big gash down the side of her face. And I collapsed and just said, I give up, I can't beat you with this. And the part said, I don't want to beat you. And that was an historic moment in the development of this model because I shifted. Now I'm not just curious, but I actually have a real sincere interest in why it does this. And I asked the part, and it proceeded to tell me how when she was being abused, it had to get her out of her body and contain the rage and get her more abused. And so I shifted once again. Now I'm not just curious, but I have a kind of appreciation for the heroic role it played in her life. And I could convey that to the part and it broke into tears. And talk more about how everybody had vilified it and tried to get rid of it, and how much it was just trying to protect. And from that point on, I've never gotten into a polarization with any part of anybody, including myself, and I've helped people actually learn to love these parts that have driven them crazy all their lives and have created terrible havoc in their relationships or given them these horrible symptoms that they come to therapists for, that it's actually possible to love and appreciate those parts who are just trying their best to keep you safe, and how much they're stuck in the past, and how much they don't realize how old you are. Actually, maybe we'll do that. I won't even give you that. I won't give it away. We'll do this in an exercise. So anyway, I'm sort of the Will Rogers of the phenomenon. I've never met a part that ultimately I didn't like. And I've worked with parts that have killed people, that have molested little kids, that have been very interested in killing me, very interested in killing my client. And I'm here to tell you that even those parts, when approached from this open-minded, open-hearted place, like the cutting part, will tell the secret history of how it was forced into this role at some time in your client's childhood usually, how much it hates having to do it, but feels like it's totally necessary. So, this is a very different paradigm from the one most therapists have been trained, and that's just the beginning of it. Let me pause here and just see if there are any questions so far, comments or reactions. This whole thing about love that we're talking about, how you relate to your parts will be mirrored or paralleled in how you relate to people when they resemble your parts. Follow that? It's sort of a law of inner and outer physics. So if you're really afraid of these very vulnerable parts of you, then when your client or your spouse or your kid shows a lot of vulnerability, you're going to get nervous and you're going to try to get them out of there. If you can love those vulnerable parts, then you can love people when they're in their vulnerable parts. So, along the lines of what you're saying. Anything else so far? The question, I think, is, do you work with people when they're in full-blown manic episodes or psychotic episodes, or do you have them stabilized first? Is that right? Is that the question? I have worked with manic parts, with people in them. It's harder with florid psychotic parts. So often I'll wait till you have more access to the client, self with those. But one of the themes of this talk is going to be that what have been traditionally considered pathological psychological processes, like manic depression, like schizophrenia, like if you work with trauma, like dissociation, like what else are trauma symptoms? Flashbacks, and so on. All of those things turn out to be the activity of protective parts. So if you think of it that way, you don't get so pessimistic, and you don't get so afraid, and you don't need to rely on so much medication, and you don't have to hospitalize, and so on and so on. And you can really just love those parts too. And that's a tough sell in our field and our culture. Yeah. But anyway, we do work, we use the model with those clients. Sometimes not, sometimes we do have to wait till whatever episode is just calm down some. Let me speak about attachment theory, since I know Mark was talking a lot about it. So there are many things about attachment theory that I agree with and think is right, but one of the most fundamental aspects of attachment theory they got wrong, and I know often when I say that, people gasp. But, there is this basic belief in attachment theory that for you to have any of the qualities that we call self, the qualities that come with what I'm calling self, you had to have gotten that from some kind of external relationship that was loving or at least good enough. Does that sound right? So either during some critical period in your childhood you got some of that, and if not, then you got to get it from a therapist, or you got to get it from a spouse, or it's got to be a relationship. Turns out that's totally not true. And in fact, this is attachment theory taken inside. So that ultimately, the goal and what we're going to show is the ability is in each of us to become that good attachment figure for our parts. Because we're born with self. It doesn't have to come from a relationship. And that blew my mind when I encountered it initially, because I had been trained in attachment theory like you. And yet, as I was working with these parts, and because of my family therapy background, I began, when I was trying to have a client talk to one part, and it was clear another part was interfering, I was starting to get to step out, just like if you were working with a family, and you were trying to have two family members talk to each other, and it was not going well, and you notice a third is interfering somehow, you ask that one to step back, getting out of line of vision of the two that are talking, and you find that things settle down. I was just using that same technique with this inner system. And I found as I did that, when enough parts would actually separate, a person would shift very dramatically into another state. And in that state would manifest qualities that knew how to heal these parts. And I would try with another client. It was like the same person popped out and suddenly could take over the session and began to relate to their parts in a totally different way. And when I would ask clients who that is, who are you? Or what part are you? They'd say, that's not a part like these others. That's more myself. My true self, that's me, that's my core, some version of that. So I came to call that the self with a capital S, to distinguish it from the common use of the word self, which is to refer to the whole person. And it does turn out, now this is 37 years later, thousands of clients, all diagnoses, thousands of people using this all over the world. We all agree that that self is in everybody, and that it cannot be damaged, and it does not need to develop. And so we have found it in people who had if you go by attachment theory, no business having any of that kind of ego strain. And yet there it is. And that ultimately forced me to shift my beliefs in a much more spiritual way. That there's something sacred about that. There's something spiritual about that. So anyway, the disservice is that then pathologizes the existence of parts. And it started with Pierre Genet, who very accurately described parts, but assumed they were the product of trauma. And this is also something we cover in this book, that produced ultimately the fear of multiplicity that exists in our culture. Such that with some clients, when I start to work with them, they'll stop and say, what do you think, I'm civil? Because everybody's afraid if they have parts, it means they're multiple. And that's part of what I've been up against in this journey. So the pathologizing of parts, I'm a kind of crusader against. There was too much of that from my point of view in the DID world. Okay, so stumbled onto this discovery that just beneath the surface of these parts is this other person who has all these great qualities. And at some point I started to catalog the qualities, and oddly enough, they all began with the letter C. So I'm going to run over the 8 C's of self-leadership. I mentioned curiosity already, so it's often the first one to show up. It's the fundamental quality. And as the client stays curious, learns about the part, and is also in a calm place. So calm is another C word. The part might share some of what it's about, which brings compassion. But sometimes you just get some heart to step back, and suddenly the client will say, I feel sorry for this part. The same part that it hated seconds earlier. Once the other one steps back, I don't know why, but I just feel sorry for it. It's compassion. And confident, no longer intimidated by it. And has courage now to go into this inner world that they were terrified of going into before. So another C word, courage. And clarity, the actual image of the part starts to change from being a big monster to now being a teenage kid maybe. So clarity. And what am I missing? Connectedness, that there's a desire to connect to the part, and a sense of being more connected, and then creativity. So the client has many more out-of-the-box kind of ways of relating to the part. So those are 8 C's of self. There are other qualities we didn't include, partly because they didn't begin with the letter C, but things like joy and equanimity and forgiveness, perspective, all characterize self. And as Bob and I explore in this book, if you look at virtually every major religion, and particularly the more contemplative sides of those religions, everybody is talking about the same thing with different words. So I stumbled onto a way of very quickly accessing what in other traditions might be called Buddha nature, or might be called Atman, or the Tao, and so on and so on. Because they're all using the same words to describe this place. And it turns out you don't have to meditate 20 years to get to it. Like I said, it's just beneath the surface of these parts. When they open space for it, when they agree to relax, when they agree to step back, immediately the client changes into this person. This is a really tough one for people to believe until you experience it yourself, or you watched your clients do it over and over. So I really don't expect you to believe it, but it turns out to be the case, which is great, great news, because the person who can heal your client is inside your client, which is a huge relief to you, because you don't have to be so clever. You don't have to give them the right insight or the right interpretation or the right directive or whatever. It's inside of them. So this is the big deal in IFS. This is the big centerpiece of the model. The pursuit of how to facilitate self-leadership has been my passion for years and years and years now. The thing is, much of the field has way underestimated their potential to heal themselves based on the reports of what their families were like, because of this belief from attachment theory and the belief that you have to become that good attachment figure as a therapist, and that can take years and years. So
And I just want to say, I meant the pathology of the adults are
I heard you. Yeah.
placed upon the child, not saying the child has pathology from the beginning.
No, but again, the pathology is the word I'm trying to
Get rid of.
get rid of. Yeah, the adults generally, their parents were abused themselves, and so they have these parts that are stuck in the past, and they can't control these parts, and so they get into it. They attack their kids. And I could take every DSM category and give you an IFS-based description of it that takes away all the pathology and gives you very clear guidelines about how to handle this person. So that's one of my crusades, is to depathologize our field, which in turn then pumps the fear out of therapists that's been pumped into them by graduate school. Sure, yeah, well, Jung was onto all of this. He talked about complexes and archetypes, and he also talked about the self. Difference, if you want a quick and dirty difference. First of all, his self was much more of an Eastern idea of self, which was a passive place that you're trying to get to. It had some of these qualities I'm talking about, but it wasn't an active internal or external leader in the way that IFS construes self. But the idea of complexes, he didn't take it quite as far as to personalize them. It's hard to describe, because Jung was all over the map in his writing. It was like different parts wrote different books. So there are times where he's really writing pretty much the same. And there are other times where, and a lot of that I think is because of his relationship with Freud and how hurt he was, and there's a lot of reasons for it. I don't want to get into it right now. But anyway, what's called active imagination is closer to IFS than traditional Jungian work, which tends to be, from my point of view, more insight-oriented, where you're trying to understand as the goal. I would say the difference between IFS and most depth psychologists I'm familiar with is that because they don't believe these are real subpersonalities, they don't have you actually directly interact with them. It's much more of a, let's figure out the signals, let's figure out the symbols, let's figure out. So it's coming from a more cognitive place, trying to interpret these messages from the unconscious. And this takes you into the unconscious and helps you actually interact with the denizens of that place and help them and access self, and self goes in and listens to and talks to them, and then actually helps them transform. Manic depression is, in the terminology, describes a polarization. There's one part of you that's trying to keep you very high, so you don't get pulled down by all this, what I call all these exile parts of you. And there's another part that's trying to keep you from doing anything, so you don't get hurt in the outside world. And they kind of alternate. Does that make sense?
A light bulb just
What?
went on. A light bulb just went on. That makes total sense.
I'll you can pay me later.
I'll build you a website.
Yeah. So let me get to this little map. There was a point where I was mucking around with internal systems and doing a lot of talking directly to parts like I was talking to you about, and finding that my clients, some of them were having really bad reactions after sessions. And it scared me to the point where I almost backed away from the whole phenomenon. But then I got curious and I started asking, what am I doing wrong? And I was taught this map that I'm going to teach you very briefly now. So what I was doing was, my clients were talking about these parts of them that were hurt and needy and desperate, and felt like that's what we needed to get to. So I was trying my best to get there as soon as possible, and indeed succeeded in many cases. And these were the clients that had these, now I call backlash reactions. And in exploring what's that backlash about, like when I would leave my office and have a car crash, or a spike of 103 fever, and so on. And in exploring what that's about, I was learning that I was not being in any way ecologically sensitive. This is a delicate ecology. And I was just barging in and opening the closets in the house and looking at all the dirty underwear, and the parents are punishing my client for having allowed that. So I began to listen for distinctions and patterns, and the biggest distinction that leaped out then, that has stayed as the biggest distinction among roles that parts are in, not the actual essence of the parts, but the roles they're forced in by a trauma and attachment injury, was between parts that are very, very vulnerable, and because of their vulnerability got hurt when you were young, and then the parts that are trying to protect them and keep anything similar from ever happening again. So these vulnerable parts we call exiles, because in addition to getting hurt, once they do get hurt, we don't want anything to do with them again. They tend to be the most sensitive parts of us, the parts that are hurt the most by humiliations or by trauma of various kinds. So once they start out as these lovely inner children that can make you feel delight and creativity and spontaneity and openness and playfulness, but then they get creamed, and now, because we don't know any better, and we just think these are hurt feelings, or these are terrified feelings, or these are shameful feelings, we lock them away inside. And everybody around us tells us to do that. Because everybody around you said, just get over it, you can't change the past, just move on, don't be so sensitive. So these we call the exiles. Everybody in this room has a bunch of them. When you have a bunch of exiles, life becomes a lot more tricky. Because if at any point one of them gets triggered and bursts out, it can pull you back into that time. It can make you feel just as bad as you did then, such that you can't function, you shake, you can't get out of bed. So then you get even more afraid of it. And you try your best to lock it up even more. And so for these exiles, it's insult to injury. The injury was the trauma. The insult is your abandonment of them and banishing of them. So they're really hurting now. And they're often dying to break out. They break out at any opportunity. So while you have a bunch of exiles, life is much more delicate. You have a bunch of parts that are trying to keep them contained and protect them from being hurt again. And they do that by trying to manage their relationships, your body, the appearance of your body, or how much they allow you to feel. Manage your performance so you don't get rejected, you don't become a failure, a loser, in Donald Trump's language. So it's a big job. They're trying to manage everything about the outside world and the inside world so that your exiles stay contained. I think Mark was talking about firefighters. So doesn't always work, but it doesn't work when the world breaks through your defenses, your exile gets triggered. It's a big emergency. Many people think they're about to die. So there's another set of parts who goes into action immediately to handle this emergency, and they do it often in a very impulsive, reactive, damn the torpedoes way. I've got to get you out of this right now, regardless of the collateral damage to your relationships, to your body. I don't care because you're going to die, they think. So these we call firefighters. They're fighting the fire of the affect that's exploded out from exile. So that's the map. It's very simple. Managers and firefighters both are a class of protectors. They're both under the rubric of protector, and they're both trying to contain the exiles and also keep the world from touching them. And the more exiles you have, the bigger their burdens, the more extreme your protectors have to be. And that's what differentiates most of us in this room from people that have big time diagnoses, and that's about it. My belief is that our field has become way too organized by neuroscience. The brain is incredibly plastic. And if you're missing a little bit up here, other places will take over. A brief example, you know the name Bessel Manor? Oh, you know him because he was here last week.
Saturday.
So Bessel and I are good friends, but we have this ongoing debate. He came to my conference one year, and he'll show that you probably did when you were here. How many of you were here? Did he show the slide of the brain of a trauma survivor who's associated? And he'll show this big blank spot where the frontal lobe, you know what I'm talking about? And he'll say, this is what we're working with. This is what we're up against. That's why we have to teach all these skills, because they just don't, they have to learn all this stuff. And what I said to him was, no, that's what your brain looks like when one of these parts is taken over. Once it relaxes and steps back, that'll all light up back up again. And he said, prove it. So we've been doing some research to try and prove that. So, yeah, so it's a different paradigm is what I'm saying. This is a very different way to understand all this stuff. It turns out to be a much better paradigm because it's very empowering both for the client and for the therapist. So this is one of my pet peeves now. So if I'm with a client and suddenly they're dissociating, I don't say, look in my eyes, feel your feet on the ground, take some deep breaths. Because what message does that give to the part that just took them out?
They're not
Yeah,
okay.
you shouldn't be here. You quit doing this, you're not okay. Or the same idea. If I'm with a client and suddenly they're having a panic attack in front of me, I don't do that. Same reason. Because you're telling this terrified little young exile part that just popped out, get out of here. You don't belong here. Instead I say, I see you're really, really scared. It's great, you're very welcome here. I'm so glad you made it. And we're going to help you. And it'll be easier to help you if you wouldn't mind separating from her a little bit so she can be with you too. And boom, my client is grounded. So we have our own way of grounding people. It has nothing to do with skills building. It's has everything to do with separating parts. And then self-emergence spontaneously. So again, very radical paradigm. Same with dissociation. You wouldn't think these dissociating parts could talk to you, because they won't talk to the client, and when they've taken over, they often won't talk. They make it so the client can't talk. But if I ask, can I talk to the part that just took you out? They, okay, so you're the part that just took her out, is that right? Yeah, that's right. And they'll talk like a little magpie to me, but they won't say anything to the client. And they'll tell me all about why they did it and what they need to feel safe to not have to keep doing this, and then negotiate, and boom, the client's grounded. So a client comes in and got some problem. I'm asking not only about how it's manifesting in their outside world, but also what happens inside of them as they have the problem. And they're describing their emotions or their thoughts and beliefs or impulses. So I'm saying, I'm just introducing the language by feeding back what they're telling me, which we all learn to do, so reflective listening. But I'm saying, oh, so one part of you gets enraged, and then another part of you gets really scared that you're going to hurt somebody. It shuts you down. Is that right? Nobody says no, because everybody uses that word. There's nobody in here who didn't say at some point in the last week, part of me feels this, and another part of me feels this. That's why I use the word part. It didn't get me very far in academia, but it's the most user-friendly term. So as you're talking to a client, they'll say, yeah, that's right. One part of me was enraged, another part of me was terrified. Okay. All right. But the rage is the one that gets you in trouble, is that right? Yeah, that's right. Okay. So I'm good at this, helping people with that kind of problem. There's a way I do it that involves a kind of inner work, which is sort of like mindfulness, but it's mindfulness with a few more steps. Would you be up for that? I guess so. That's why I'm here. Okay. Then go ahead and focus on that rage. Find it in your body or around your body. And virtually everybody can do that. And then tell me how you feel toward that rage. Now that might seem like an odd question, but it turns out that you all have relationships with these parts. So I'm scared of it because it gets me hurt. It gets people hurt and it gets me in trouble all the time. This would be common with your prison population. I totally get why you're so scared of it. And we're not going to have it take over more. We're just going to get to know it. And it'll help us get to know it if the one who's so scared would give us a little bit of space. And would relax in there a little bit, just a little. No, it does, it's really reluctant to do that. Okay. How about if we start with the rage in a kind of contained room in there? Okay, that works for it. Okay, then let's get the fear to just give us some space. How do you feel toward it now? I'm curious why it's so angry. Now I know I have what we call the critical mass of self to proceed in a way that's going to be useful. So we access self first, ideally. Then we have self dialogue with parts, and then at some point we have them dialogue with each other with self as kind of their therapist. What I'm saying is there is a self to your inner system, and you have a bunch of parts that also have a self. And it's, everybody know the metaphor? Turtles all the way down. It's like fractals. These are, we won't go too much further than this because it'll blow your mind and we'll have blood on the walls. But it's nested little fractal systems. But the self that I'm talking about is in there, is different than the parts, while they do have their own self. But this self is covered over by parts who blend with it and take over. Many clients don't have any clue that that's in there until these other parts have separated. shame is a hugely powerful driving force. It's a big, big currency in these inner worlds. And it usually is a two-part phenomenon. There's the part that carries the exile, that carries the worthlessness. And then there's the critic we've been talking about, so the part says, I'm a shit, I'm worthless. The critic says, yeah, that's right, you're worthless, you're bad, you're evil. And the two of them together are a very tough combination. And then you have to have firefighters like our president has to get away from all that, to just stay above it. Does that help? What are you afraid would happen if you didn't do your job? And then in answering that question, you learn either about the exile it protects or about another protector that it's polarized with. So you might learn, if I didn't attack you this way, you would be rejected because you wouldn't work hard. So that's an exile that carries the rejection or the shame. It might also say, if I didn't criticize you this way, then you would continue to be a sex addict. And I can't stand that you're doing that. And so I have to... So whichever it is, then we negotiate with it. If we could fix that, would you have to keep doing this? No, but I don't think you can do that. Let's take suicide. So most of us have a hierarchy of firefighter activities. So if the first one doesn't work, you go to the next one. If that doesn't work, the next one. At the top of that hierarchy for most everybody is suicide. It's this huge comfort to you and your clients that if the fire gets that hot, there's this exit strategy that's totally effective. And here we come along as well-meaning therapists and say, I want you to sign this contract saying you're not going to kill yourself. And you wonder why clients go crazy, because you took away their safety net. So instead, I would say, and often I'll do what we call direct access, I would say, let me talk to this part that wants to kill you. Are you there? Yeah. So you're determined to kill her, is that right? Yeah, that's right. What are you afraid would happen if you didn't kill her? Usually you get one of two answers to that question. Guesses about it? The pain will get worse, or you'll just suffer the way you're suffering. It's too much, I can't stand it. That's the most common answer. The second most common answer is you'll continue to do this evil thing that's hurting people, or you did this evil thing 20 years ago and I can't forgive you and I have to kill you. If we could get her out of her pain in a different way, would you have to kill her? No, but I don't think you can do that. Would you give me a chance to show you that we can do that? Okay, got nothing to lose, I'm gonna die. So then we go, we heal the exile, we come back, it doesn't want to die. The biggest antidote to suicide is hope. People will not kill themselves. That part won't take you out if it has any sense there's an alternative. So I'm constantly pumping hope. And I, again, 20 years, chronically suicidal population, virtually didn't hospitalize anybody. Just negotiated with those parts over and over. So, different paradigm. So I told you a little about my father and my burdens from him. So that sense of failure that he gave me and worthlessness drove me, because I'm the oldest of 6 boys, 3 of whom are world-class medical researchers and teachers. So I should have been that, and I was a big disappointment to him. And those, talking about shame and worthlessness, those were my propellants. That drove me to prove that I could bring something valuable, of equal value to what they're doing. And it also created this part that was very useful with my father, that would make me not give a shit about anybody. That could protect me from his criticism by just not caring. And so that combination got me pretty far, because I could get up in front of the Department of Psychiatry grand rounds where I was working in University of Illinois at Chicago, where there's this sea of white lab coats like psychiatrists used to wear, like they were real doctors, and present on this thing as a 32, 33-year-old kid, and then have actually famous analysts in the audience get up and try to humiliate me and not care. And just, that part just, he's an asshole, so. And that all carried me quite a distance. And then I started to be a leader of a community. And those parts started to really get in the way. And because it was the not care part, it was also a kind of arrogant part, like Trump, like I'm so cool. And then there were the worthless parts. And so then I started getting feedback from people that I'm being an asshole. And what I'm proudest of is that I actually listened to it and took it seriously and did my work so that I can be the leader that I am now. And I don't have that much of that at all. I come across as quite humble, I would assume. And it's very genuine. I don't have parts that feel like I'm this fabulous person that is so cool because he discovered this. But I did. So.
Whoa, okay. I think that's always the issue, how sometimes you think you have self and then maybe you have the part in a room because you started out that way, and then what you feel is self goes into the room, but the part's not responding to it as the part would respond to self. And then you begin to suspect that something else is in there with it. So I always find that the most useful intervention is the one where I ask myself what else is up for me at that moment. What agenda or what am I doing that's mixing in with myself so that actually the person can't go any farther. So I think patience is good, but sometimes moreover just checking oneself, not just checking your impatience, but checking to see what the hell is up for you that actually has to step back before the client can go any farther.
Very much. It brings up a whole other topic, which is there's a class of managers, I think I heard Lori talking about it earlier, that we call self-like parts that sort of mimic the self and do things like in Bruce's situation would be the one he was watching trying to do it for him. Remember that? And then we had to get that to leave. And so we as therapists have that too. And what Lori's saying is many people, many therapists I've worked with are doing their therapy from a self-like part for various protective reasons. And it's sometimes a huge identity crisis when you realize this thing that I thought I was, I'm not. Because they're often you're very ego-identified with them. They feel like that this is really you. And at first, it's scary, but then it becomes a huge relief. So what is commonly called enlightenment in spiritual traditions is really just that shift in your center of gravity of your identity from your parts to yourself, and really, really believing in your bones that that's who you are. That's what virtually every spiritual tradition calls enlightenment. It's just that simple.